Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today for another one of our OT IoT threat intelligence report reviews. Today, we're going to be sharing some of our insights from our recently released report, which you can find on our website. And then at the end of our session, we're going to have a Q&A session where you'll be able to ask us and our threat intelligence team some questions. Make sure you use the available chat window in the webinar to do that. So joining us today are two familiar faces and esteemed colleagues from our threat research team. And you've probably seen them quite a bit in our webinars lately. So first, Alessandro Di Pinto and Ivan Speciali. Would you guys like to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
Yeah, sure. Hello, I'm Alessandro Di Pinto. I lead the security research team, which has a very important mission, keeping customers safe. And here with us, we have Ivan, a security researcher, making that happening. Ivan, if you want.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Ivan Speziale and I'm a security researcher here at Nozomi.
All right, so without further ado, let's begin. So as I mentioned, we have a threat intel report that we released for the second half of 2020 with a lot of very interesting findings that we're going to go over today. So next slide, please. That report has a lot of information available in there. And the goal of our report is to basically give an overview of important security events, identify the things that are happening in our space and highlight trends that we may see across attackers and threats, as well as provide you with actionable items that you can do in your environment to make yourself more cyber resilient. Next slide, please. So the agenda of today's session is going to be, first, we're going to just discuss the threat intelligence report and what's in there. And then we're going to hit on persistent ransomware, supply chain security after that. And that's been in the news a lot lately. You may have heard, with SolarWinds and some of the other stuff. And then we're going to follow up with a few recommendations, and then we're going to end it with a QA session at the end. So without further ado, let's kick it off. First, Ali, where do we start? This second half of last year and this year has definitely kicked off to a wild start. So where do we even begin? There's so many cool things in your report. Where's the best place to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, we have to start from somewhere. So the first topic that we are going to talk about is persistent ransomware. The main goal here is to provide an overview about the trend that we observed in the wild, and then jump into a real case scenario in order to cover the tactics used by an attacker and understand how it's possible to protect networks from this kind of incidents. If we can go to the next slide. Ransomware operations continued steadily during all the second part of the 2020. And at the moment, seems that the trend is still continuing in that way. You are probably already familiar with some of the tactics involved during attacks. So in the next slides, we are going to putting all the pieces together in order to show how attackers are able to keep persistent inside before basically reaching the final step, which is deploying the ransomware itself. But why are we considering that as the final step? The reason actually is quite simple. Once the attacker decides to infect a system with a ransomware, they are aware that defenders will immediately start to take countermeasures and likely to start a forensic investigation. In fact, in that moment, the attacker usually already reached the main goals like data exfiltration or compromisation of a key system. So we basically already got the first point. Ransomware infections are no longer based only on massive spear phishing campaigns and targeted are all increasing every day. That it's possible because attackers are sharpening their tools to perform sophisticated attacks, including also the target selection as the first step, basically. In fact, as we already reported during the year, the attacks to healthcare sectors, for example, have been increasing in the past years. And that is another reason to fully understand how attackers work in order to improve defending the networks. We'll be focusing on that in the next slides, if we can just jump ahead. Okay, so let's start discussing the operational part, discussing the approach used by threat actors performing real-world attacks. One of the most important decisions is the target selection. On that decision depends most of the attacking strategies as difficulty and risks, because are strictly depending on this decision. So the target is usually selected using one of the following criteria that we can see on the right. The first one is vulnerability-based target selection, where after an initial evaluation, the attacker decides whether to attempt the intrusion or not. It is usually based on results coming from automated tools, and should be considered, let's say, the easiest way to find a target which is just exposing a vector to be exploited. So it's there, it's just needing to be exploited from the attackers. The second one is selecting companies based on specific characteristics. An example could be selecting a company operating in the healthcare sector using a specific type of devices provided by a specific vendor. The last criteria that we have is buying access somewhere in the internet. Usually it is the black market. And in this case, the attacker is not investing time looking for a specific company, but just searching for an easy to access target. Of course, the research can still based on specific parameters like sector or even country. Next slide, please. Okay, the phase number 2 is extremely important, as the attacker, basically after an attack, doesn't know where he landed after the initial access. In fact, it can just be the employee's computer or a system inside the management network segment. So in the first moment, the attacker doesn't know where it is. And soon after the initial access, the attacker will start scanning and observing the network in order to figure out the environment where he landed. If the security systems fail detecting the intrusion, the first step, here the defenders has a second chance to detect the attack. In fact, the attacker will start trying to access more systems to gain, for example, better visibility inside the network. And for doing that, is going to do a lateral movement. So lateral movement is a step required to jump inside the network. The lateral movement is basically the action to jump from a compromised system to another one, increasing the number of the systems under control. Of course, for doing that, the attacker needs to generate artifacts, generically speaking, artifacts inside the network, and that could be detected by systems monitoring the environment.
So there's quite a mix of automated and manual operations taking place there. It's like there's definitely people behind what's going on, and when they're targeting these organizations, the manual piece of this is really where they're penetrating and doing a lot of the lateral movement, basically.
Absolutely, and also it depends by the environment. So in some kind of environments, for example, critical infrastructure, attackers are doing manual scannings to stay under the radars. So yeah, it very depends on the environment, but yeah, absolutely. And that is the reason why monitoring the network is very important, because it's the best way to spot an attack that actually maybe it's just starting. In fact, defenders has a big opportunity to intercept anomalies at this stage, as you said, because network scans or exploitation attempts could help discovering incidents in the first stages, let's say. Yeah, as we will discuss later on, network monitoring is one of the pillars to increase the security level. And the big advantage that defenders have is that they just need to detect one suspicious indications, while attackers has to be hiding all their moves. So one error or one detection and the whole attack operation could be completely discovered by defenders. So now, Ivan has a strong experience around this topic, so please feel free to continue with the next slides.
Yes, thank you, Alessandro, for the introduction. Let's move to what we call phase number 3. At this stage, the attacker might have mapped with surgical precision the target environment. He might know everything, but crucially, he still has to do 3 important things that to make the whole operation successful. The first one is the actual access to the assets of a company. The second one is to exfiltrate the valuable data stored in the assets. And the third and final one is the deployment of the ransomware. As you can imagine, these events represent, let's say, 3 different choke points where defenders have a lot of opportunity to detect this attack. For instance, when a company asset is assessed, defenders can put additional authentication mechanisms, some notifications, some techniques to detect anomalies in the way these assets are assessed, maybe out of office hours. There is a lot that can be done in this specific phase. And also it can be customized based on the specific asset and then specific environment. We then have the exfiltration of the company data. As you can imagine, if you reason about a network, exfiltrating means moving typically an high amount of data out of this network. And depending on how your environment is organized, this can quite easily represent an anomaly that can be detected by your monitoring infrastructure. For instance, you might have backup that could expose, let's say, similar characteristics, but it's very unlikely that an exfiltration will resemble precisely a backup. There have been instances of attack where this was true, but let's say it's still an anomaly. And then you have the deployment of the ransomware. If you follow, let's say, the technical blog post and all the details that we know about how a typical ransomware is deployed within a machine, you will know that what happens is typically there is a bunch of services or processes that run within the target machine that are stopped, and then the ransom is deployed. As a defender, you can just detect that. It's quite an anomaly when you see, let's say, critical services within the target machine to be stopped. You can either, let's say, react automatically, for instance, unplugging some systems out of the network, or just alert the defender team. There is still a lot that you can do before, let's say, everything gets compromised. And we can then move to the phase number 4 in the next slide, which is the incident management and response phase. When we reach this stage, essentially the attack has already taken place. But unfortunately for the victims, there is still a lot that can go wrong. Depending on where your company or organization is legally registered, there are some obligations that you might have to fulfill. For instance, you might have to publicly disclose the attack if the ransomware gang hasn't already done for you, which typically can happen. You might not be able to pay the ransom if you're considering to do that because of, let's say, rules that have been deployed in the US last year. So what we'd like to stress here is that the incident response is something that you need to plan ahead of time, because it's not only a technical problem, and we can move to the next slide, please. For instance, it's taken for granted that we have backups in place. Many companies already do spear phishing protection, implement spear phishing protection, and perform spear phishing exercise against their employee. But as we said, it's not only a technical problem, but it's a legal problem. It's a PR and communication problem. For instance, if you're a service company that are providing some services to your customer, what are you going to tell them in case you get compromised by a ransomware? So we believe there is a lot of value in performing a careful simulation of all these different phases, so that every single aspect within your company, from the technical to the legal to the comms to any organizational aspect you can think of, is let's say, as a plan and an agenda to follow in case, let's say, things go bad. We can move to the next slide, Ale, and get back to you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so now let's move with the next hot topic we have for today, which is supply chain security. So we can jump in the next slide, please. Okay, let's start with a quick introduction. Okay, we discussed several times about hardware and software supply chain and the need to have that process secured. Usually there is a bit of confusion around the topic, so let's clarify a couple of points before moving on. The wording software supply chain may not be the clearest way to describe the problem, because most of the companies are using software coming from third parties. So let's say most of the situations can fall inside the supply chain. But at the end of the day, there is a big difference between an updated provided by a big vendor and a TCP/IP network stack used by an embedded device, for example. Both are software, of course, but the difference lies in the fact that in the first example, the company knows the source, the security policy behind it, and the availability of security updates, the rate, etc. So regarding the second one, the device, the hardware, usually the company knows just the device name and maybe the purpose, but likely ignores the details about, for example, the software inside, updates, and so on. So on one hand, we have that hardware is part of the game, absolutely, and cannot be avoided. And on the other hand, we have that supply chains risks cannot be avoided, but can be mitigated. And this is the part where we want to discuss about. SolarWinds incidents was just an example of the risks involved during the software distribution. But let's imagine also all the minor software that users usually install automatically, clicking on a button saying that a new update is available and ready to be installed. So we'll continue on this topic in a while. So right now, let's focus on the risks hiding inside the hardware that companies deploys, also inside critical environments. Yeah, okay, exactly. Ripple 20 is the excellent example about how many risks are hiding behind a simple hardware deployment, which is coming also from a big vendor. Ripple 20 is basically the code name of a set of vulnerabilities affecting the TCP/IP network stack called Track, and used by a large set of embedded devices, also involving critical infrastructures, as we said before. Now, all the physical devices are running software to work, but also to communicate over the network, for example, because all the communications are based on software which is run by the hardware itself. So the risk is not related with the software itself, but instead with the fact that usually companies completely ignore this point, bringing inside the network devices which are not updated because not included inside the standard update policies that the company usually has for the classic software. So Ripple 20 is an example, for example, basically demonstrated the risk that lies in the fact that companies are using affected devices that don't know about it, don't know about the running version of the software, and have no idea about if and when a security update will be available. So this is a perfect example to highlight the importance of having secured and monitored supply chain, as attack vectors are not only a backdoor software. Even though Ripple 20 has been an outstanding research, the real exploitation risk remain low, since, because the requirements for exploitation tend to be pretty specific and not so common in a real environment. One of the challenges that organizations have is to fully understand the real risk, because usually it's not possible to completely disconnect or replace an entire set of devices, especially true if it is involved in a critical process or, for example, in an hospital. On the other hand, those vulnerabilities are still there and, of course, cannot be just ignored. So what we can do? What are the remediations? Before introducing new devices, it is a good practice basically performing a proper due diligence of the vendor, their security practices, and availability of the security updates over time. Another interesting point would be to perform a security assessment on the devices, with the main goal, of course, to identify new vulnerabilities, or just scanning the network in order to figure out inside the environment potentially vulnerable assets. So to keep track about what can be dangerous, and we need to keep an eye on it. Last but not least, network monitoring again. As we discussed before, having visibility inside the network is one of the best approaches to detect threats in advance, even before they can start creating damage, because we can spot scannings or reconnaissances. So there are a lot of activities that can be detected in advance using network monitoring. Okay, in the next slides, Ivan will be moving back on SolarWinds, getting the opportunity to discuss also possible mitigations to keep in consideration, with the goal to increase the supply chain security.
Thank you, Ale. So, as we all know, in the last couple of months, we've talked extensively about the SolarWinds Orion compromise. Obviously, this was before, let's say, the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities started to show up. But nevertheless, SolarWinds is and is going to be pretty dominant in the cybersecurity space. So we pretty much know many of the details behind this pretty sophisticated espionage operation. And from the way the binary code of Orion was Trojanized, to the way, let's say, the targets were selected by the operators, and so on and so forth. So while the profile of the threat actor here is, let's say, the one of an elite team of a nation state, so this might not represent the average target of an organization, it's still extremely important for anybody to carefully study and understand what happened, because the tactics, the techniques used by elite team today, as we see in history, they tend to become, let's say, the average tool of the trade for tomorrow average attackers. So we need to understand precisely what happened and what you can do. We can broadly divide the whole operation in 3 phases. So we have the first one in which the SolarWinds network was compromised and the Orion code was backdoored. We have the second one in which the compromised Orion was deployed by the victims. And eventually we have the third phase in which the second stage deployment was in fact deployed against a selected number of victims. We don't know precisely, publicly at least, what happened, how the SolarWinds network was compromised. But for today, we are going to focus on what I believe is the most interesting part in this whole operation, which is how the Orion code, binary code was backdoored, and what you can do to defend yourself against this scenario. Next slide, please. So we can approach this problem from a couple of perspectives. The first one is the one of the software developer. So you're a software developer and you develop a binary product that is later distributed to your customers. The second point of view is the one of the end user of this binary product that could theoretically be compromised. Let's focus on the first one, on the development side at first. So there are a couple of interesting approaches here that you can try to follow to mitigate the issues. The first one is the use of a code analysis engine like CodeQL, which is used by Microsoft. The really nice idea here is that you can perform semantic queries against your source code in order to find specific patterns. For instance, in the case of SolarWinds, once you understood, let's say, the sort of modification that an attacker can do to the source code, you can find and search for the very same pattern against all your source code that is queryable through this engine. Obviously, this approach is pretty interesting, but has some limitation. If, for instance, we take the very case of SolarWinds Orion, the way the binary was backdoored was through a compromise of the machine compiling the code. So the source code was changed on the fly, and to a third party, it would appear as, let's say, as clean, while the artifacts, the binary, was in fact compromised. So what can you do to defend against this specific scenario? An interesting approach is the one of deterministic builds, which is used, for instance, by the Tor project, where it's pretty simple to explain and a little bit more complicated to actually implement in your own pipeline. So it means that given a set of source code like any project, it doesn't matter in which machine you compile this source code, this set of source code files, the binary has to be the same, with the same hash. So that in a world where you can just spawn a container anywhere in the cloud, you can compile this piece of software. It doesn't matter in which environment, as long as obviously it has the tools necessary to complete the job. But the idea here is that you use multiple machines in different environments, and you need to obtain the same final binary. Where is the problem? The problem is that you need some sort of tooling around. You need a specific compiler to support this approach. But given the importance of the SolarWinds events, we believe that this approach will take, let's say, will become popular very soon. Let's move now from the point of view of the software developer to the point of view of the end user. of a binary software. Next slide, thank you. Here, obviously, you have a different set of problems. You need to carefully watch to any service, any binary that you bring within your own company, and try to understand what can happen if this piece of software is compromised. The first strategic choice, which I understand is a bit abstract and might not be very practical, is the one in which we try strategically to avoid concentrating many privileges in a single point of failure. For instance, we can try to spread privileges across different software stack that could perform one single task. So that in the event, unfortunate event that a specific software stack becomes compromised, we can still limit the impact and we can disable pretty soon. And there is a lot of we can, let's say, work around this issue. The other more practical solution, obviously, is the one of having a network monitoring infrastructure in place to have a complete visibility of what happened. So if, for instance, we take the case of Orion, we could have seen when the DNS queries the starting to, let's say, communicate back to the attackers took place. So more strategically, you can understand when a software that was compromised started to behave in a way that was not designed for. So at the end of the day, security is a process. So you cannot just expect to install a single product one day and magically defend against all the supply chain attacks that can take place. But what we believe is that you need to design your security posture with some principles in mind, and the tools that you use and you design and integrate within your own specific network should behave according to those principles. Thank you. Chris, I think we can move to wrap it up.
Yes. So I think we can advance our slide. There we go. We have a few recommendations. Some of them you've already heard today. If you could advance the slide, please, Sandy. So you heard Ivan just bring up a very important point, which is monitoring the network. And I'd like to add to that point that it's very important to get that in early rather than in the midst of dealing with an incident. Those that put it in early are going to be much more capable when it comes to doing the forensics and the recovery efforts, because they're going to have an awareness of what their network normally behaves like, and then what it behaved like after a compromise. So they'll be able to pick up on all that lateral movement and so on. And also, in order to make the lateral movement and the other phases a lot more difficult, attack surface reduction is very important. You want to know where your vulnerabilities lie and then have a path to remediating them, and then be able to track the success of that remediation effort to understand if there's any pockets of your network that you may have missed, and then also making sure that that's operationalized so it's not a one-time thing where you run through and patch everything up and then go back to our old ways again. So we want to make sure we have a process for keeping our systems up to date, and we're tracking that and reporting on that and making sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce the attack surface. And then another point that Ivan brought up was the identity and access management. In the case of SolarWinds, that was a lot of concentrated risk in one place with all those credentials to practically everything. So you want to spread that out a little bit. And, if you have a security operations tier on your network, you may want a separate PKI system to manage the routers, the switches, firewalls, the Nozomi Networks estate, everything else, and keep that separate from maybe your Active Directory and your operations of the enterprise itself. And furthermore, maybe even take your industrial control systems and peel off maybe an independent domain, maybe even under a separate technology that's managing that, so that if something does happen to one technology, that the blast radius will be confined and it won't be able to spread as quick. And having good DR plans is key, testing those often. Active Directory hardening is also going to be part of the attack surface reduction, but making sure that you have plans in place for if something happens at that level, because that can be very difficult to recover from. Successful compromises of the directory are pretty expensive to get back under control again. Securing a remote access. A lot of times people like to recommend separate systems, one for remote access and then one for monitoring, so that if the remote access fails, whether it's at the firewall or a network segmentation level, that you have another technology that's monitoring all that remote access. But in the very least, you want to make sure that that remote access is as secure as possible, preferring stuff like two-factor authentication, and making sure that the machine behind that remote access only has access to what it needs. So you don't want to put that on a very important system, like prefer not to have like direct remote access from the internet to your Active Directory. And then DNS over HTTPS, you want to be aware of all that stuff. There's a lot of IoT devices out there that are starting to leverage DNS, a lot different. And their attackers are as well. They're using DNS for command and control. So you want to start to open up your awareness of how DNS is being used in your enterprise. Keep an eye out for things like blockchain infrastructure. It's another common tool that an attacker will use to obfuscate their movements and what they're doing. And then awareness of legitimate online services abuse. So you may have heard of the recent water plant incident. That was a case where a normal user or an unknown user leveraged pre-installed sanctioned remote access software that was allowed to be there. And they basically abused existing infrastructure to do something bad. And all of the stuff was supposed to be there. Maybe it could have been configured differently, but it wasn't like they came in and installed a bunch of things that didn't belong in order to take advantage of the system. So having a good understanding of everything that's in your environment, asset inventories and all the software inventories and so forth, is going to be very important to securing your infrastructure. Next slide, please. So now we have the Q&A session. And I believe I saw a couple questions coming in. So let's see who will take this one. First question, one from Luca. Ali, I believe that you'd be the best candidate for this one. How can incident response begin if most likely no one is yet aware of the malware being installed? If exfiltration has not happened yet, there might be no visible traces. So am I wrong? Ali, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Ciao, Luca. So basically, I see two big scenarios here. So the first one is you're in a company and you got infected, okay? But the company is monitoring the network. So in that case, I guess to install the malware, somehow you received an email or some artifact through the network. So they're monitoring the network. You have an opportunity to spot before the installation of the malware, the attempt, let's say, okay? The second one is a very different scenario. So you are outside monitored network with your laptop, you got infected, maybe browsing or doing something else. And then you bring inside the network, the company, your laptop. Okay, if the malware is inside doing nothing and you don't have any software inside, running inside security software, running inside your laptop, yeah, it's, I guess, not possible to spot it. But as soon as it will start to exfiltrate data, maybe using DNS tunneling, you can start immediately detecting that traffic, or maybe just contacting the command and control to get more payloads, more modules, etc. Another way to detect it. Or maybe the attacker is just connected to the malware and scanning the network to do lateral movements, as we discussed before. Another opportunity. So yeah, another scenario that I see is that you are outside the network, the monitored network, but you have software inside, like an antivirus. Boom, there you can detect the malware. So there are a lot of ways that defenders can spot the attack. As I said before, we just need one indication to spot the attack before it will start.
Yeah, that indication could be anywhere. It could be on the host itself, on the network, on the recipient side. It could be an impact in the industrial process. There's so many things to look for. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ali. There's a lot of opportunities to pick up on their motions and behaviors. So next question, and I believe this one's perfect for you, Ivan. From Roberto, question 2. Do you think the tools such as breach and attack simulation, like automatic software, can help increase defense level in the case of supply chain attacks?
Yeah, I think it largely depends on a tool-by-tool basis, because it depends if such tools end up stressing supply chain attack surface. I'll just make an example, which is not about a breach and attack simulation tool, but more to red teaming. And it actually is SolarWinds Orion, before becoming, let's say, public through the well-known compromise. It was actually pretty known between red teamers because they were using it to move laterally across network as the threat actor eventually did at scale. So those who were buying this sort of red team engagements were actually exposing that part of the supply chain. So again, it's on a tool-by-tool basis. I think in the whole topic of supply chain, the concept is to try to enumerate all the services, all the devices that you have within your network, your organization, and try to understand maybe by making an order based on how critical those services are, and try to understand what's behind those companies, what's behind those software stacks. And then you will try to make some light on those issues. And if there is a breach and attack simulation tool that can do just that, it could be extremely helpful. But I believe that is more of a hybrid approach between automatic and manual tools and operation that can help you.
Great. So the next question we have, so I'll take this one, is could Nozomi Networks have helped with the Oldsmar water plant attack? So first, since publicly we don't really know who the perpetrator was yet, I like to refrain from calling it an attack. I like to call it an incident. It could have been many different things. But essentially, in a nutshell, the TeamViewer product was installed on a system that also had the human-machine interface, like the digital gauges to control the water plant industrial systems. And the person used that sanctioned software to access that HMI and then adjust a setting in there basically from a number of 100 to 11,100. And that particular setting was dangerous level of a poison that's used to clean the water. So there's a few different pieces along there that we've covered today. One is the initial infection. Okay, that wouldn't have really happened here because it was an IT installed, or with IT somebody sanctioned installed that software. So there's no malware to detect. Then there's no command and control systems to detect either, or lateral movement. So there's a lot of pieces where we may have cybersecurity tools that may not have been as effective in the Oldsmar incident. However, our product is able to monitor also the industrial process itself. And when the person changed the setting from 100 to 11,100, we would have picked up on that anomaly that would have been buried deep inside the industrial process. So if it was a genuine attacker from outside, we probably would have picked up on it way earlier. We would have seen the initial intrusion, the lateral movement, all the reconnaissance activities before the lateral movement, and then bringing in the payload and all that kind of stuff. We would have seen all that happen first. In this case, though, it would have only been the detection of the anomaly in the industrial process that would have alerted the operators to what was going on had somebody not watched the mouse move around on the screen. And I think a more sophisticated attacker or someone who was trying to do damage probably wouldn't have had the mouse moving around on the screen at the time, or they would have done it after hours where it was less likely to be noticed. So that is a little bit alarming that it was a very low bar set on the security, and it was fairly easy to accomplish the incident, and it would have taken a fairly sophisticated tool to pick up on the artifacts left behind or the result of that particular incident. So I hope that answered your question. Next question. I'll let either one of you guys pick up on this one. Which kind of threat actor between nation states and ransomware should a company prioritize its defensive capabilities for?
Yeah, you can go for it, Ivan, if you like.
Okay, so that's a pretty interesting one. So obviously, while everybody gets excited or depressed when a new nation state operation gets discovered and becomes public, and maybe new fancy techniques become known publicly, at the end of the day, there is for the average organization, the ransomware operation are still the biggest risk. And the actual nice property of this operation is that if you can protect your company against all the issues that this sort of operation exercise, you actually end up with a pretty good security posture. Essentially, I like to call informally ransomware attacks like the penetration test you didn't ask for, because many times this is what it resolves to. So obviously start with protect against this sort of activities. And when you've built a solid baseline, you can start to build more sophisticated defensive tools on top of it. Thank you.
Great. So next question. It's saying either one of you guys could answer this one, I'm sure. Is the recent wave of attacks against Microsoft Exchange really that serious? Before you answer, let me just throw mine in there. Yes, it is. So feel free to agree or disagree.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, I'll go for it. Yeah, I agree with you, Chris. And yes, it is a serious vulnerability for, let's say, different several reasons. First of all, I think many organizations never plan around the fact that the exchange could have been compromised so badly in that way. So yeah, it can be considered a single point of failure. And the second point is that an attacker that has privileges to Exchange will be able to move laterally, as we discussed a lot during this webinar, pretty comfortably inside the network. So problem is the patching now. So companies can patch, of course, but it's not guaranteed that the attackers already compromised the system before. So of course, it's mandatory to patch for sure. But what we can do, there are some artifacts that can be checked inside the machines, but problem there is that actually we should be very confident that just checking that artifacts, we are safe enough to say, okay, I'm safe. Nothing happened in the network.
Right. I mean, it's like a boat with leaks in it. You could plug the leak, but you still got to deal with the water that got in. I mean, you can't just plug the leak and then think everything's going to be okay. And, it's, bad. Some of these holes have been there for over 10 years. Like for 10 years, these guys have had free reign of these systems. And I think one of the scariest parts that I know Yvonne brought this up in one of our conversations previously was that these Exchange servers are typically connected straight into the Active Directory systems. I mean, this is the internet connected to a box that has everything, all the keys to the kingdom.
Yeah, I like to joke that, let's say, if you had an internet exposed Exchange, a threat actor that is stealing your email is the list of your problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then how do people onboard folks that are new to the company. You hire a new security guy. What do? You email him his credentials. You email him the IP address. I mean, not us, but most companies use email to send important things around that they wouldn't want compromised. But yes, you wouldn't want your Active Directory compromised even more.
This sort of vulnerability, let's say, was considered a sort of a unicorn for years. So it's not like, as Alessandro was saying, everybody was planning. It was like deemed to be, I wouldn't say invincible, but yeah. And then this happened. So yeah, exactly. It's a big lesson for everybody, which means that you should always plan ahead of this sort of situation. It doesn't matter how unlikely they seem to be. You shouldn't allow a single point of failure to bring down your company.
Yep. You know, I'd like to say, even more so recently, it's not if you're going to get hacked. It's not when you're going to get hacked. You've probably already been hacked, and you need to have stuff in place to quell that worry. And if you don't have the capability to convince yourself that you're not hacked, then you don't have the knowledge that you need to really know that you haven't been. So you should operate like you have been. Chances are, based on this information and the tens or hundreds of thousands of organizations that have been affected by this stuff, there's a good chance that either you or someone very close to you, like a partner corporate business or someone who's helping you with your security or ordering paper or something in your enterprise has been hacked. And it's at your doorstep. The enemy is behind the gates. And I think that we should move forward by taking a closer look at all of our systems and, you know, approaching it in the mindset that there's probably bad guys around us right now. And we need to start being diligent and put our boots on and get out there and start looking for them. So let's move to the next slide, please. And I think we're going to close up with some resources that you can find that will help reinforce some of the ideas and concepts that we've talked about today, as well as get more details about some of the interesting topics, the ransomware and some of these attacks. So first, the report itself. It is chock full of information. There's great chapters on some stuff that we didn't even discuss today. So if you found anything today interesting, I highly encourage you to take a look at this, the Q2 2020 OT IoT security report that we discussed today. We also have a blog written by both Ivan and Alessandro that you see today on the top OT IoT security threats and vulnerabilities that we've pulled from that report. We also have our threat advisories, community tools like our Guardian Community Edition, and a whole bunch of other useful things that you can download for free and use within your environment. Those are available at the link you can see there in our labs. We also have the Verkada ransomware blog that we wrote up with some really good details on that particular supply chain attack and why it's particularly dangerous and how to defend against it, as well as a blog that I wrote on the Oldsmar water facility and what we could do to improve our cybersecurity resilience on that front. And then also some more information on the SolarWinds attack. And then, as always, you can just go to our homepage and find way more than what we've listed here. This is just a small subset of the information that we have available on our website. So, Ivan, Ali, do you have anything else you'd like to, any parting words of wisdom for our folks? Or shall we just sign off?
Yeah, I think we covered quite a lot. So probably we are going to talk very soon about the exchange aftermath, let's say.
Yeah, still going. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you both for the wonderful report as well as the time today on the webinar. And thanks to all of our participants, especially those that asked questions, and everyone out there that's keeping our society up and running and increasing our cyber resiliency. So thank you very much from everyone here at Nozomi Networks, and stay safe, stay secure, and we'll see you on our next webinar. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.